Pristina. British Foreign Secretary Robin Cook has said Arkan's men have been incorporated into the Yugoslav army. During the breakup of Yugoslavia in the early 90s, Arkan and his followers were in Kosovo. He's suspected of being instrumental in the suppression of the ethnic Albanian population at that time. Arkan, who is the leader of the Party of Serbian Unity, has denied his men are currently in Kosovo. But at the same time, he threatened that they would be there shortly if any NATO soldiers set foot on Serbian soil.
We'll send a message to Bill Clinton.
Arkan's patron is Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic, the man ultimately responsible for the so-called ethnic cleansing currently underway against the Kosovar Albanians. Milosevic argues that Kosovo is the cradle of Serbian culture, and he will go to great lengths to maintain control over the region. Milosevic's career as a nationalist politician began in Kosovo, invoking the Battle of Kosovo as founding myth of Serbian nationhood, and presenting himself as the savior of the Serbian minority there. He revoked the region's autonomous status guaranteed in the Constitution in 1989. He rose to power on a wave of Serbian nationalism. Milosevic has always been at pains to distance himself in public from the activities of Arkan and his Tigers, but the two men have known each other for years. Interpol has warrants out for the arrest of Arkan for a string of robberies across Europe in the 80s and for shooting his way out of a Swedish courtroom. These days, he presents the image of an entrepreneur and family man. A few days ago, Arkan was seen at a protest in Belgrade against NATO airstrikes.
The crises happening are not always one and the same. She found a virtually empty NATO reception centre, devoid even of aid workers.
But we need them to get these people out of the buses, so we can release the buses and get some more people. So we go and talk to them.
There isn't anyone there who would talk to you. There's one lady and I can't find her.
So now she knows for herself the frustrations of those who are genuinely trying to do something at the inefficiency, incompetence and obstructionism of those who just say they do. In that last group include the Macedonian government, whose foreign minister put in a brief appearance at one camp today and stayed just long enough to pass the buck.
Minister, why is there an empty camp here and there are 30,000
Please ask NATO authority here.
This is the reality of the situation, a refugee camp without any refugees. The British Army erected this 24 hours ago. Just down the road are 30,000 refugees, some of whom have been living in the open now for 5 days. Just over the border there are 30, 40, 50,000 more waiting to get in. And yet this camp is empty. Mrs. Short's message may have got through because not long after she left, refugees who'd spent up to 15 hours waiting in buses were allowed by the Macedonians into one of the camps. But it's a drop in the ocean. Keith Graves, Sky News, Skankovic, Macedonia.
NATO spokesman Jamie Shea has been...
Again, Slobodan Milosevic will continue until the refugees are allowed back to their homes. The latest strikes have hit hard in Belgrade, and the better weather is likely to mean more raids. Sky's diplomatic correspondent Tim Marshall has witnessed the NATO attacks for himself.
The emergency services worked through the night, travelling from one location to another. Above them, cruise missiles were coming in. I saw several barrages of anti-aircraft fire going up to meet them. At one point, overhead, what sounded like a plane could be heard. As the fires burnt, the authorities said they'd hit 3 cruise missiles. We have no independent confirmation of that. This is what the location the fires were in looked like today. This is the Zvezdara district of the city centre and is, or was, a police complex. Many other targets were hit, including Belgrade's civilian airport and other towns in Serbia. Water tankers were brought in to assist the fire crews. At this rate, the authorities will eventually run low on water as well as fuel. Tim Marshall, Sky News, Belgrade.
America is sending 24 Apache helicopters to the war zone. Their role is to destroy tanks. The Pentagon insists that it's not a prelude to sending in ground troops, but some military experts say that is now inevitable.
The arrival of 24 Apache helicopters over the next few days will see a dramatic shift in the conflict. Although the Americans and NATO have insisted this is not a step towards the deployment of ground troops in Kosovo, it will mean 2,000 soldiers on the ground in Albania. The very way Apache helicopters operate, flying close to their targets, makes them much more vulnerable to counterattack than cruise missiles launched from bases hundreds of miles away. The British Prime Minister, writing in the Sun newspaper today, again reiterated his opposition to ground forces. There is no question of NATO ground forces being sent in, he said, unless it is to police an agreed political settlement. But there is an appetite amongst certain sections of the military, including those with experience of the region, that ground troops are the only solution.
There is only one way you can possibly stop, or try to stop, because it's impossible to stop completely. Ethnic cleansing by small groups of men who knock on doors and drag families out and butcher them or send them on the way while they burn their house, or both. And that is to actually have soldiers on the ground to protect people. That is the only way it can be done. Bombing will not affect that.
NATO insists the low-flying Apaches are simply a logical extension of the air operation, but that their greater precision and all-weather capability during the day or night will enable the Allies to do a more effective job of neutralizing the Serbian forces on the ground. Alex Crawford, Sky News.
Meantime, military aircraft from NATO countries are continuing to fly tons of aid into emergency border camps. In Britain, charities are stepping up their appeals for help. Tomorrow, they will join forces to raise millions of pounds. In Scotland, collection centres are already opening up and the aid is pouring in.
The plight of Kosovo refugees seems to have struck a chord with the British public. In Edinburgh today, there were queues at one collection centre where people donated blankets, clothes and food by the sackload.
We thought we might do a little towards it. It may not be much, but every little bit helps.
Money too has been raised, £50,000 in just one day in Scotland. Charities and church groups are overwhelmed by the response.
Everybody is just heartbroken by what they've seen on their television screens and are just burning to do whatever they can to help.
Tomorrow sees the launch of a new national appeal, a rare joint effort supported by 12 leading aid agencies, including the Red Cross, Oxfam and Christian Aid. Once collected, though, there are still practical problems delivering relief to where it's most urgently needed. Road transport is slow. Helicopters are the quickest way over treacherous mountain terrain.
We're providing water, food, shelter, housing, bedding, medical supplies, but also helping the people to deal with the trauma that they have gone through, because as people are seeing, people are emerging out of Kosovo with extreme traumatic experiences.
And with tens of thousands stranded in appalling conditions, relief workers say help cannot come soon enough. John Ray, Sky News.
Und hier zusammengetrieben haben. Zum Abtransport an die mazedonische Grenze unter Drohungen. Wer nicht geht, wird erschossen. Die Serben haben uns gezwungen, in die Züge zu steigen. Wie Tiere haben sie uns zusammengepfercht, 100 bis 150 Menschen in ein Abteil. Wir wussten nicht, wohin es geht, wir hatten Todesangst. Niemand hat uns irgendwas gesagt. Kurz vor der Grenze hielt der Zug. Zu Fuß über die Eisenbahnschienen müssen die Menschen ihre Heimat verlassen. Und die Serben gaben ihnen noch eine Warnung mit auf den Weg. Rechts und links der Gleise sei das Gelände vermint. Wie auf eine Einbahnstraße gezwungen, gehen die Menschen einer ungewissen Zukunft entgegen. Erschöpft, mittellos. Das Einzige, was sie retten konnten, ist ihr Leben. Wir haben Pristina verlassen, weil wir gehen mussten. 5 Minuten haben die Serben uns gegeben, um unsere Häuser zu verlassen. Sie haben gesagt, sonst würden sie uns eine Kugel durch den Kopf jagen. Bilder aus Pristina und aus Peć im Westen des Kosovo, ausgestrahlt vom serbischen Fernsehen. Die NATO habe hier alles in Schutt und Asche gelegt, sagen die jugoslawischen Behörden. Viele Flüchtlinge aber haben andere Erinnerungen. Serbische Soldaten und paramilitärische Einheiten seien in die Dörfer gekommen, mit Panzern, schwerem Geschütz, Maschinengewehren. Viele Frauen seien vergewaltigt, Menschen auf offener Straße erschossen worden. Dann hätten die Serben die Häuser geplündert und verwüstet.
Our houses
Die meisten unserer Häuser sind niedergebrannt worden, sind durch schwere Artillerie bombardiert worden. Solche Szenen, die habe ich noch nie in meinem Leben gesehen. Wie soll ich sagen, unsere Herzen sind bereits gebrochen. Überprüfen lassen sich die Berichte der Flüchtlinge nur schwer, denn die internationalen Beobachter und die meisten Journalisten mussten den Kosovo verlassen. Aber es gibt auch Wahrheiten, die keine Worte brauchen.
Wie brutal war Rasnatovic, Anführer der berüchtigten paramilitärischen Tiger, die eine blutige Spur hinterließen. Er selbst nannte sich Arkan. Nun sollen seine Truppen wieder im Einsatz sein, im Gebiet von Pristina. Und wie britische Regierungsmitglieder kürzlich meldeten, ist Arkans Truppe auch in das 52. Armeekorps der jugoslawischen Armee eingegliedert. Eine Nachricht, die nicht verwunderlich klingt. Schließlich diente der Kosovo bereits vor Jahren Arkan und seinen Männern als Machtbasis. Hier soll er maßgeblich an der Unterdrückung
Angry over delays by Macedonian officials, the United Nations calls for its own workers to process the thousands of Kosovo Albanian refugees backed up at its border.
The numbers of refugees streaming out of Kosovo are staggering. Nearly 250,000 have now entered Albania. Like Macedonia, the government there says it can't cope. And the air war intensifies. The United States offers a powerful tool to NATO, Apache helicopters, designed to hit tanks and enemy ground troops.
In other news, the 2 Libyans accused of bombing an American airliner over Scotland in 1988 are in the Netherlands to stand trial under Scots law before Scots judges. Hello and welcome to this World Today special on the Kosovo crisis. History will have to decide to what extent, if any, NATO's airstrikes provoked the orgy of Serbian terror that put at least a quarter of Kosovo's population on the desperate highway to the border. But history will have to wait. The urgent need now is not just food, not just tents, not even rudimentary sanitation, but simply space to put them in. At current rates, Kosovo will be emptied of its Albanian population in less than 10 days. Just a few minutes ago, the United States repeated its call to other countries to assist in easing the refugees' plight. Small wonder, as Macedonia, one of the major host nations the straggling convoys are heading for, says it's already full. The exodus was well underway before the bombing. It began over a year ago as the internal conflict in Kosovo forced people from their homes. But the last 12 days have seen the trickle become a flood. The hardest hit host country is Albania, where UNHCR says there are now around 250,000 displaced Kosovo Albanians. 226,000 of them have arrived since the NATO campaign began on the 24th of March. Neighbouring Macedonia has seen a total influx of 136,000 Kosovo Albanians, of whom 120,000 have entered since the airstrikes began. In Montenegro, there are now over 60,700 Kosovo Albanian refugees. Again, most of them, 35,700 in this case, entered in the last 12 days. The British Foreign Secretary Robin Cook says the NATO offensive against Yugoslavia will continue until President Milosevic pulls his armed forces out of Kosovo and allows all refugees to return under the protection of an international force. He was speaking after the alliance carried out some of the heaviest raids of its campaign. Jim Fish reports on the latest stage of the NATO offensive, which struck at several military targets in Serbia and in Kosovo.
This is just part, the visible part, of the human tide flowing out of Kosovo. Behind these refugees queuing for entry to Macedonia, many thousands more in a line stretching back into Kosovo for more than 20 kilometers. This young man was among tens of thousands forcibly deported from Kosovo's capital, Pristina. The police separated me from my family, he says. I'm on my own. I don't know where to go or what to do. Macedonia has been slow to let them in without guarantees from NATO and the West of the means to house them. Those means are now being hurriedly prepared, temporary camps inside Macedonia and Albania, and the offer of sanctuary for more than 100,000 of them by NATO member states. Diplomats acknowledge that refugees must be moved away from the border. even if that confirms the success of the Serbs who drove them out.
Today's problem is to make sure these people are safe and under tents and get them some food and water, and that's happening. And we're also looking at how to get them out of here as soon as possible onto some of the receiving countries, and we expect to see that process start today.
NATO says it will now hit hard at the Serbian forces in Kosovo, which are causing so much suffering.
We are now getting our tactics right, making sure that we've got all our forces in there. We have ramped up the number of sorties that we're doing, and we are prosecuting and taking the fight to them very hard. And I think that you will find very direct results coming very shortly.
24 Apache helicopters offered by the Americans will be a significant boost to NATO's firepower, but only from the air. There's no change yet to NATO's vowed policy to keep troops out until they can enter Kosovo in safety. But NATO's own maps admit that the only resistance to the Yugoslav forces is coming from the weakened guerrillas of the Kosovo Liberation Army, squeezed into a western corner of Kosovo. Where they're not out in the open, Yugoslav forces in Kosovo, such as these Third Army units, are well concealed and difficult targets to hit. NATO has shown its ability to destroy fixed military and strategic targets, as these pictures from Serbian television show, but that's quite a different matter from stopping the ethnic cleansing, something that NATO has not even come close to achieving. Jim Fish, BBC News.
Well, live now.
This is the case, and we have, in fact, offered that perhaps what we should do is move these caseloads to the transit center that NATO has built and to do the registration there. We received the initial agreement from the Macedonian government, and we are trying to go ahead and move forward with this now.
But briefly, when is that going to become a reality? We're seeing before us now pictures of the desperate plight of women there with children, with not even a change of underclothes.
Exactly. This is sanitation and health hazards are probably our biggest two concerns after shelter right now. We're looking at a situation where we already have a vulnerable population, very susceptible to any health hazard or health problem. In addition to that, we have these outdoor conditions that are not only muddy and wet, but now cold at nighttime. So we desperately...
Well, as you heard earlier, Albania has been the country worst hit by the exodus from Kosovo, but the international community is now stepping in with commitments to help those countries immediately bordering Kosovo. As refugees continue to flee across Kosovo's borders in their tens of thousands, NATO has quoted offers from many of its member states to resettle refugees on a temporary basis. Among those figures, Germany has promised to take in 40,000, Greece 5,000, Norway 6,000 and Turkey 20,000. The United States has offered to take a further 20,000 and Canada 5,000. Britain is expected to take about 10,000 more refugees. Well, in a moment I'll be speaking to a representative of the Refugee Council here in Britain about the temporary asylum being offered. But first, our correspondent Clarence Mitchell reports now from the town of Kukës on the Kosovo-Albanian border.
Inside Kosovo, Jakovica is being burnt, suburb by suburb, as its overwhelmingly Kosovo-Albanian population flees. This systematic torching by Serb forces of one of Kosovo's smaller cities has, international observers told us, been underway since the NATO offensive began. And this too is where refugees have reported hundreds of young men being killed in the streets. Many of the dispossessed who make it to the Albanian border at this extremely remote mountain crossing are in shock. They speak of atrocities, men used as human shields, young women raped. The aid agencies transport the few they can. Even it seems the gravely ill are being forced out.
It seems that the hospital in Jakova has been emptied, and in fact we are receiving a lot of sick people, old people. We are receiving also women with who witnessed atrocities, and they were mentioning children have been killed in front of them.
Nearly 5,000 climbed through this wilderness yesterday. Thousands more are following these footsteps. They gather at the first flat spot, dislocated, anguished, waiting for a scale of organised help that isn't there. A tiny medical team tries to cope as local Albanians struggle to reach them. With their city burning behind them, these refugees have fled through one of the most remote border crossings into Albania. And now they sit here in the open, waiting for what little transport there is. Some aid workers believe the Serbs intend to make it increasingly difficult for them to help these people by forcing refugees to flee through even more inaccessible points higher in the mountains, and some of those are landmined. 2 hours down the mountains in the town of Kruma, the nearest hospital is already overwhelmed by Kosovo's Albanian ill. Dozens of refugees now crowd into squalid, tiny rooms attended by just a handful of overstretched, under-equipped doctors. And in a corridor, useless bedsteads stand. There are no mattresses or blankets for these. Whole families spanning generations now face a life like this. Among them, parents with enough concerns of their own. Ethnic cleansing, it seems, spares no one. Clarence Mitchell, BBC News, on the Kosovo-Albania border.
To these NATO camps. But the problem is we've just walked down there just a few minutes ago and there's 2 buses loading up with people. There are 10 more sitting nearby, empty. This is going to take a very long time. The Macedonian authorities have started to move, but they're still moving extremely slowly.
The other problem that we've heard about over the last few days has been the problem of processing people who suddenly have no identity whatsoever crossing an international border. Has that eased up at all?
Well, again, that seems to be what is slowing things up, because the Macedonian authorities are determined that everyone should have the correct papers. So they're actually giving people registration papers when they come in. Obviously, these people, many of them have had their documents taken off them by the Serbs as they came out of Kosovo. But the Macedonian authorities want to be sure that they know who these people are, where they've come from. And they're very alarmed that they may escape from the refugee camps and seep out into Macedonia itself, where they can't be monitored. So this is a slow process. Everyone's name has to be taken, they have to write it down, and they have to be sorted out, and then they can be sent to the camps. I spoke to some of the British soldiers at this NATO camp this afternoon, and they were saying...
There are 8 or 16 of these Hellfire missiles, a range out to 8 to 10 kilometres. It's got a gun on it which can rip through any of the armoured vehicles which the militia have there, so it's a very effective system out to about 2 kilometres, and it has rockets as well. And of course it can operate right down low, slowly where places where other systems can't operate. This is what Apache can do. It can hide behind a hill, just having its nose visible at about 8 kilometres. You can't hear it and you can't see it there. You can see the little aiming system there, and the pilot can and the co-pilot gunner can identify the target from that range, and then they can loose off missiles or rockets at the target. The other system they have here, we're not sure if it's going to be the one with the radar on top. This little donut on the top you can see there, that identifies the target using radar. That means that actually the helicopter can be lower, and it also means it can pass the targets off to another, well, up to 64 aircraft if it happens to have them there. The Americans are only talking about having 24. And they can all identify different targets. And there you can see the aircraft at night. It's equally capable at night as it is in daylight.
It was very effective in the Gulf War, but it seemed to operate close in to the targets, as you say, and there it was largely involved where there were ground troops in the area, ground troop support as well. Is that important or not here?
Not really, I don't think. I mean, during the Gulf, and this is vision from the Gulf here, you can see that this is the open fields of plains of Iraq, the desert in Iraq, and attacking places like radar centres. This was a radar centre right at the very beginning of the campaign, and you can see their radar tower. You can just make it out. Very useful at doing that.
And for the thousands of homeless Kosovars.
NATO claims a noose is being tightened on the Serb armed forces, better weather arrives, and more NATO weapons are on the way.
Also ahead in this hour, more than 10 years. To our viewers around the world, welcome. It's April 5th.
From CNN and CNN International, this is CNN Today. Until everyone, thanks for joining us. I'm Natalie Allen.
I'm Lou Waters. Within the next half hour, President Clinton is to speak about the refugee crisis in the Balkans. The United States and NATO are trying to save tens of thousands of Kosovars deported by the Serbs and wage an air campaign at the same time. Despite the burden of the refugee crisis, the alliance says today it's beginning to zero in on Serbian forces in Kosovo. CNN's Jim Clancy brings us the latest from NATO headquarters in Brussels. Jim.
Good evening, Lou. Well, the situation here is that NATO is active in the air, NATO is active on the ground. NATO is also moving ahead with what could improve its chances of stemming the tide of refugees, and that is counterbalancing the force in place by the Yugoslav military in Kosovo. This day, the NATO Council met, 19 ambassadors deciding to take the formal move to request Albania to allow the deployment of Apache attack helicopters, some 24 of them, on its territory. That would include some 2,000 support troops as well. These helicopters, a major addition to NATO capabilities. They are able to get, in the words of NATO officials, up close and personal to the tanks and the troops of the Yugoslav military and paramilitary forces deployed on the ground there. Still, NATO officials are concerned. Why? Let's take a look at the map. Some NATO ambassadors fear deploying the helicopters in Albania could draw that tiny, impoverished nation into the conflict. Moreover, they fear that unable to strike against allied military forces, Yugoslavia's military might target refugees that are crowded along the border. But the deployment, again, is moving ahead.
Very good morning to you. You're watching Sunrise on Sky News. It's Tuesday, the 6th of April.
Serbian authorities are claiming that a NATO cruise missile has hit a residential area, killing at least 5 people and injuring more than 30. The bomb hit the town of Aleksinac, 100 miles southeast of Belgrade. Sky's diplomatic correspondent Tim Marshall says he saw around a dozen streets which have been devastated. There's been no response from NATO so far.
The other main developments this morning, NATO jets have attacked targets in at least 5 towns in Yugoslavia on the 13th night of airstrikes. An oil refinery was hit in Novi Sad. Another bridge over the Danube is also reported to have been destroyed.
British defence officials say Harrier jets have completed their most successful night of attacks in more than a week. Up to now, the Harriers, flying from their base in Italy, have been forced to turn back time and time again by bad weather over Yugoslavia.
Up to 360,000 ethnic Albanians are now believed to have fled Kosovo since the start of airstrikes. The massive humanitarian effort to help refugees has increased in urgency. Soldiers and aid agencies are working to provide food and shelter. But we start this morning with the claim that a cruise missile has hit a residential area southeast of Belgrade. Homes in several streets were demolished. Serbian authorities are claiming that there were no military facilities nearby. Sky's Tim Marshall was one of the first journalists to arrive at the scene.
The centre of Aleksinac is in ruins. Dozens of buildings have been smashed. Perhaps 300 apartments have broken windows.